Something is wrong with the old story of human origins, and the clue is buried far from the famous valleys, lakes and savannas where we were taught to look. It is not in the open grasslands of East Africa, where the horizon stretches clean and bright, and every fossil seems to arrive already framed as part of a familiar ascent. It is in the darker belt of the continent, in the forest zone of West and Central Africa, where the soil is wet, the roots are deep, the air is heavy, and the past is difficult to hold. In that world bones vanish, camps sink into acid earth. Wood, hide, fibre and plant tools vanish almost without a trace. Even stone, the most durable witness of ancient life, lies hidden beneath green growth and later occupation. And yet, from this difficult landscape, 3 clues have emerged that force us to look again at the entire shape of African prehistory. A strange skull from Nigeria, an ancient paternal lineage in Cameroon, and stone tools from West African forest environments that show humans were there far earlier than the old narrative allowed. The deeper you look, the less Africa resembles a simple birthplace, and the more it resembles a continent of hidden human worlds. The familiar story begins with an East African garden of origin, a place where Homo sapiens formed, expanded, and eventually replaced older kinds of humans everywhere else. It is clean, elegant, and easy to remember. But the actual evidence is not clean. It is braided, regional, uneven, and full of populations that do not fit. West Africa, long treated as an empty space in the human story, is now becoming one of the most unsettling parts of the map, because it preserves signs of deep continuity that do not flow neatly from a single cradle. It shows human groups enduring in isolation, carrying ancient ancestry, ancient tools, and even skull shapes that look out of place in their own time. In any case, the rainforest was never just a background, it was a world of its own, and it kept secrets. The first clue came from a rock shelter in southwestern Nigeria, at a site known as Y-Haplogroup. There, in the 20th century, researchers uncovered a human skull that should have been easy to classify. It came from a time near the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, close enough to us in evolutionary terms that the skull should have looked plainly like that of a recent Homo sapiens. By that time, people across much of the world were making refined tools, living in complex social groups, burying their dead, and adapting to shifting environments after the coldest phase of the ice age had passed. A skull from that age should not have carried the shape of a much older world. Yet Y-Haplogroup did. Its vault was long and low rather than high and rounded. Its cranial form did not fit easily among recent humans. Its shape seemed to pull backward, toward older African forms, toward a deeper population history that had survived in West Africa far later than expected. That is the first unsettling detail. Y-Haplogroup was not an ancient fossil from 300,000 years ago. It was not a relic from the early emergence of Homo sapiens. It belonged to a person who lived at the doorway of the Holocene, close to the beginning of the world we recognize, and yet the skull carried features that researchers compared with much older African material. Something does not quite fit. Either West Africa preserved an unusual local form of Homo sapiens that had been isolated for an immense span of time, or it preserved the biological echo of contact with a deeply divergent human population. Neither answer supports the simple garden story. Both point instead to a continent where different human groups endured side by side, sometimes apart, sometimes merging, sometimes carrying forward traits that elsewhere had faded. Now consider this. The skull alone would be strange enough, but it does not stand alone. In Cameroon, not far from the broader West African rainforest belt, genetic research uncovered one of the deepest paternal lineages yet known among living humans. This lineage is often called a double zero. It sits near the root of the human Y chromosome tree, branching away from other known paternal lines so deeply that its age reaches far beyond the shallow timeline once imagined for living human diversity. A double zero is not merely an old family marker. It is a genetic fossil, carried by living people, pointing toward a population history in Central Africa that reached back hundreds of thousands of years. The location matters. This signal appears in the Cameroon region, a rugged and forested zone, close enough to the Nigeria corridor that it cannot be dismissed as irrelevant to Y-Haplogroup. Fossil shape and genetic depth begin to point toward the same part of Africa. Indeed, the human story in this region begins to look less like a single expansion and more like a long survival inside refugees. During harsh climatic phases, forests contracted, savannas shifted, deserts expanded, and corridors between populations opened and closed. In such a world, the Cameroon highlands, river systems, and forest margins offered shelter. Groups could become isolated, not because they were primitive, but because geography and ecology protected them. Isolation does not mean stagnation. It means a population follows its own path. Over many thousands of years, that path creates distinct features, distinct genetic signatures, and distinct cultural patterns. The old model expected modern humans to emerge in one main zone and then spread outward. The newer evidence points to a structured Africa, where multiple branches of humanity existed within the continent itself. The most powerful version of this idea comes from ghost ancestry in West Africa. Genetic models indicate that some West African groups carry a substantial contribution from a deeply divergent human source, one that split from the ancestors of living humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. This source is called a ghost population because we do not yet have its bones securely identified, and we do not have its ancient genome. But its signal appears in living DNA, like a submerged shape beneath water. It is not the same as Neanderthal ancestry outside Africa, and it is not the same as Denisovan ancestry in Oceania. It belongs to Africa's own deep population structure. The implication is enormous. The continent did not simply create one modern form and then send it outward. It contained ancient human lineages that separated, survived, and later merged. This changes the question around Y-Haplogroup. Instead of asking why one late skull looks strange, we ask whether that skull is a rare physical glimpse of a wider biological pattern. Was the person from Y-Haplogroup part of a local West African population with deep roots? Was this individual descended from a mixture between expanding Homo sapiens groups and an older West African lineage? Was the skull a sign that the rainforest belt preserved forms of humanity that the fossil record barely captures? These are not fringe questions. They arise directly from the mismatch between the old story and the evidence. A skull from 12,000 years ago should not look like a messenger from a much older population. Yet it does. The genetic evidence should not point toward such deep, hidden ancestry in West Africa if Africa was a simple cradle with one main stream. Yet it does. Then comes the stone tool evidence, and the story becomes even harder to keep inside the old frame. West Africa has now produced early Middle Stone Age material reaching back around 150,000 years, including Levallois technology. Levallois tools are not random flakes struck from stone without foresight. They require planning. The toolmaker prepares a core, shapes its surface, controls the geometry, and then strikes in a way that releases a flake or point of desired form. It is a method built around mental rehearsal. The final flake exists in the mind before it leaves the stone. When this technology appears in West African contexts, especially in settings tied to wetland, coastal, forest, or forest edge environments, it breaks the old assumption that early human success belonged mainly to open savanna settings. The standard picture gave the savanna too much credit. It treated open landscapes as the great engine of human intelligence, the place where hunting, walking, planning, and social life sharpened the human mind. But West African tools say that another kind of intelligence was also unfolding in the green world. Rainforest life demands a different knowledge. It requires memory of seasonal plants, hidden water, animal paths, climbing resources, toxic foods, edible roots, fibers, resins, and wood. It rewards people who understand vertical space, dense vegetation, and small signs. It does not leave behind dramatic open-air kill sites as easily as a dry basin. It hides its archaeology. But hidden is not the same as absent. The tools show that humans were not merely passing through these zones. They were adapted to them. The question is simple, and it is disturbing to the old model. Who was making those tools? The easy answer is Homo sapiens, because by 150,000 years ago, our species already existed in Africa. But the difficult answer is that Africa at that time was not occupied by one neatly uniform people. The makers of Levallois tools in West Africa could have been early Homo sapiens, with a regional identity unlike Eastern populations. They could have been a related but deeply divergent human population later absorbed into Homo sapiens. They could have been part of the same broad-structured network that later left ghost ancestry in West African genomes. The tools themselves do not give us a face, they give us a mind. And that mind was capable of planning, teaching, repeating tradition, and surviving in environments once pushed to the edge of the human story. Anyway, this is where the rainforest becomes almost like a character in the story. It protects people, then destroys their traces. It allows isolation, then erases the evidence of isolation. It creates refuges, then covers them. In the Congo Basin and the wider Guineo-Congolian forest zone, preservation is a brutal filter. Bones break down, ancient camps vanish, organic tools disappear. The people who lived there almost certainly worked wood, fibre, plant matter and resin, but those technologies rarely survive. Stone tools are only the hardest fragments of a much larger world. When we look at a Levallois flake, we are not looking at the whole technology. We are looking at the piece the forest failed to consume. That matters because rainforest adaptation often leaves evidence in the wrong materials. Spears, traps, digging sticks carrying nets, bark containers, cordage, plant medicines, and wooden platforms all matter in forest life, but almost all of them vanish. So when archaeology finds only stone, it undercounts intelligence. It makes people look simpler than they were. In open, dry settings, the past leaves a louder signal. In wet forests, the past whispers. That whisper has been mistaken for silence, and from that silence came the idea that West and Central Africa had little to say about early human evolution. Now the whisper is getting louder. The pygmy question belongs here, but it has to be handled seriously. Central African forest foragers, including groups often called pygmy peoples or Mbuti, are not living fossils and not unchanged representatives of an ancient species. They are modern people with their own histories, languages, marriages, trade networks and identities. Their smaller average body size and lighter pigmentation is a real biological pattern connected to rainforest ecology, mobility, heat, nutrition and life history, but it is not evidence of being less human or outside Homo sapiens. It is an adaptation inside our species. What makes these groups important for deep history is not caricature. It is that rainforest peoples preserve clues about how humans adapted to dense tropical environments and how later farming and iron-working expansions changed the genetic and cultural map of Central Africa. Only 10,000 years ago, most of sub-Saharan Africa was populated by these lighter pigmented pygmies. Before the large expansion of Bantu-speaking farmers across much of Central, Eastern and Southern Africa, the forest belt contained many older forager societies. The spread of farming, iron technology, and new language communities transformed the continent. It did not erase everyone, but it reshaped ancestry, territory, social networks, and survival. This means the Africa we see today is not the Africa of 20,000 years ago, and certainly not the Africa of 150,000 years ago. The modern map is a late map. Beneath it are older maps, some almost completely buried. The Bantu referred to the pygmy as the orange hobbits of the forest. Forest foragers are one surviving clue to those older maps, but they're not the whole answer. They are part of a much wider pattern of deep population structure, ecological adaptation, and later demographic replacement or absorption. This is why West Africa feels so dangerous to the old East African garden narrative. It does not merely add another region to the story, it changes the logic of the story. If a deeply archaic-looking skull existed in Nigeria around 12,000 years ago, then modern human form was not evenly distributed across Africa in a simple sequence. If a double zero survived in the Cameroon region, then some paternal lines reach back into a population structure far older than the neat origin model suggests. If ghost ancestry contributes a major share to some West African genomes, then archaic or deeply divergent humans did not vanish early from Africa. If Levallois technology persisted in West Africa across astonishing spans of time, then cultural evolution did not move in one clean ladder from old to new. It moved regionally, under ecological pressures shaped by isolation, stability and contact. The contradiction becomes sharper when we compare West Africa with better-known regions. In Eastern and Southern Africa, archaeologists have long traced changing tool traditions, symbolic objects and fossils that help shape the mainstream account of Homo sapiens' origins. Those places have evidence, and evidence drives narrative. West Africa had less visible evidence, so it was pushed into the background. But absence of evidence in the rainforest is not evidence of absence. It is often evidence of destruction, concealment and lack of excavation. The old story was built partly from where fossils were easiest to find. Dry basins spoke loudly. Forests stayed quiet. Now that the forests are beginning to speak, they are not confirming the old story, they are complicating it. Now consider the human drama behind this. Imagine a population living for tens of thousands of years in forest refuges, not frozen in time but locally adapted, carrying traditions that worked so well they did not need constant replacement. Their tools were planned and taught. Their bodies were shaped by marriage, isolation, diet, movement and climate. Their genetic lineages carried depth almost beyond comprehension. Then climate shifted. Corridors opened. Other groups entered. There was contact, exchange, marriage, rivalry, conflict and absorption. The result was not disappearance in a single moment. It was blending. Old ancestry entered new populations. Old skull shapes appeared in late individuals. Old paternal lines survived in living men. Old technologies endured beside changing worlds. Y-Haplogroup becomes more than a skull in this light. It becomes a face from the meeting zone. It stands at the edge of the Holocene like a witness who refuses to fit the expected script. Its importance is not that it proves a separate species survived into recent times. Its importance is that it proves the range of African humanity was wider than the simple model allowed. The person behind that skull belonged to a real community, with parents, food, burial customs, memory and landscape. Yet the bones carry a shape that seems to remember an older population. That is what makes the find so powerful. It is personal and continental at the same time. The Levallois tools deepen the same mystery from another direction. A skull tells us about bodies. A Y chromosome tells us about descent. Ghost ancestry tells us about ancient mixture. Tools tell us about behavior. When all four lines point toward deep West and Central African complexity, the old model begins to crack. The people of the rainforest were not late arrivals into a marginal zone. They were part of the deep human story. They occupied landscapes once dismissed as barriers. They carried technologies that lasted because they worked. They lived in worlds where stone was only one part of survival. They were not waiting for history to arrive from the East. They were history. In any case, the phrase modern human starts to feel less simple after this. Modern in anatomy, modern in behavior, modern in ancestry and modern in culture do not always arrive together. A population can make sophisticated tools and still carry archaic cranial traits. A person can belong to Homo sapiens and still carry deep ancestry from a divergent African source. A society can retain Middle Stone Age technology long after other regions shift to different toolkits, not because it is backward, but because its existing system fits the environment. The ladder model fails because human evolution was not a ladder. It was a forest, which is fitting, because some of its deepest branches were literally hidden in forests. That is the real terror for the standard narrative, not monsters, not giants, not fantasy. The terror is that the old map was too simple. The garden was not one garden. Africa was not a single origin point followed by a clean expansion. It was a continent of regions, refugees, mixtures, survivals and returns. East Africa remains central to the story of Homo sapiens, but it is not the whole story, and it never was. West Africa and the Congo Basin force us to confront a deeper truth. The places that preserve the least can still matter the most, because their silence was created by nature, not by emptiness. So who made the tools in the West African rainforest 150,000 years ago? The honest answer is that they were humans close enough to us to plan, teach, adapt and endure, but the exact shape of their ancestry is still unresolved. They could have been early Homo sapiens. They could have carried ancestry from a deeply divergent African lineage. They could have belonged to the structured human world that later produced the ghost signals found in West African DNA. The stone tools do not settle the question, they sharpen it, and that is why they matter. The Iwo-Eleru skull, the A00 lineage, the ghost ancestry of West Africa, and the Levallois tools of the forest belt all point toward the same conclusion. The human past in Africa was not a straight road out of one birthplace. It was a vast, tangled landscape of populations that separated, survived, and met again. Some lived in valleys, some lived near coasts and wetlands, some lived under forest canopies where the ground itself worked against memory. Their bones are scarce, their camps are hidden, their names are gone, but their signals remain in skulls, stones, and bloodlines. Thank you for watching. The next time someone tells you the story of human origins began in one clean place, with one clean population and one clean path into the modern world, remember the skull from Nigeria, the ancient line in Cameroon, and the tools buried in the green darkness of West Africa. The deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes, because the forest did not simply hide our past. It protected parts of it long enough for us to realize that something in the old story was never complete.